He's Marler, and this is his music show.
Hello again, everybody, and welcome to another craptastic episode of the Marler Music Show. I am David, otherwise known as the Marler. Hope everyone's having a fantastic afternoon and day today, wherever you are and what you're doing. This week, I'm going to do something a little bit different. It's kind of a review, also something I hope will spark some conversation about a topic that kind of near and dear to my heart a little bit. Kind of grew up on this type of music. Is kind of a genre that has, went away for a long time and has come back a little bit. Some of the bands are back up and at it pretty well. And that is the hair metal of the 80s. Yes, that's what I said, the hair metal of the 80s. Looking back on that whole era, it was a very cheesy time. It was something that at the time it was so cool, all these bands and all this flash and all this look and everything. And most of the music was crap for the most part, but there was a lot of really good bands in that era. And a lot of bands are still active today, still doing very well today. But there were a lot of bands that, looking back, were really bad. And some of those really bad bands had a couple pretty darn good songs, but just overall, they just weren't that great, and that's why they're still not around. We're going to get into all that. So this past week, I worked a late shift at work. I usually work between like 6 and 7 in the morning until 4 or 5 in the afternoon, and I had to work from 11 a.m. until we closed. So I'm the type of person, when I get home from work, I can't just drop and go to bed. I've got to, I had to eat something, and I had to, kind of wind down or whatever. And I did it for 3 nights this week, and over things Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. And so, to get something to eat, come home, my wife's in bed, she's asleep. I'm like, well, I need something to watch. And so earlier in the week, maybe even last weekend, I was looking over Facebook, just scrolling, and an advertisement on Paramount Plus came up for a documentary that I think just came out fairly recently. It's fairly new from what I understand. It's called "I Want to Rock the '80s Metal Dream." And so I thought to myself when I saw them, like, it looks interesting. We'll give it a shot. So I got home Wednesday night, watched the first episode. And so it's got a couple fairly popular faces in there, especially if you were around listening to that music at that time and even since then a little bit. So you've got Dee Snider of Twisted Sister. Everybody knows him. I feel like, he was very controversial, very popular, and very outspoken. Still is. You've got Ricky Rackman, who was the host of Headbangers Ball for, I want to say, the majority of the time that was on the air. I know the first couple years or so, I think Adam Curry did it, and then Ricky Rackman came in and just kind of took it all the way through, especially through the transition period that this documentary gets into. You've got John Corabi. He's been in several bands. He was in Scream, but he's possibly most popular for being the replacement for Vince Neil and Motley Crue back in 1993-94. And kind of as a sidebar on that, I think that album that they put out with him is, and I may get a lot of negative feedback on this, but I feel like that's one of their best albums. It was a lot more grittier in certain ways. It wasn't all about sex and drugs and girls and everything. And it kind of went away from all that. And musically, I think it was a little bit better for some reason. I don't really know why, but for some reason, musically, I think it was a little bit better. So he's in it. Dave Sabo from Skid Row is in it. Kip Winger from Winger. Wayne Isham, who was a very popular video director back in the 80s. I know he did a lot of Motley videos. I think he did some Poison videos and some videos for other bands. You've got Janet Gardner, who was the lead singer in Vixen, who actually, for her age, looks really good. Vixen's one of those bands I never got into. Like they had one or two songs that were really popular, but I never could get into them. As a teenage boy, they were great to look at, fantastic. But past that, and I feel like that's unfortunately for them. Um, that's the way they're reviewed by the general public was, it's great for the teenage boys to look at, and they were sex symbols and all this and everything. But anyway, she's in that. It tells her story. And a lady called Vicky Hamilton, who I think I'd heard her name before. She was a manager of bands in the mid to late '80s, early through late '80s, really. Excuse me. And a lot of people don't know she was the original manager of Poison and Guns N' Roses. And this kind of her story goes into how, she kind of was doing that, and because she was a female in a male-dominated industry, that it was one of those things where she always kind of got it taken out from under her and was left with nothing. But anyway, so she's in it. There's a couple other minor characters in this thing. Um, I say characters, people that are interviewed about their stories through this whole thing, but those are the main players in this thing. So what it does is it kind of starts. It goes back and forth a little bit, but it gives like it starts. There's a scene with each one of these people, and then it tells the kind of their beginning story, and then it goes back and forth with all their beginning stories, and then it goes kind of in the middle when they kind of made it and everything, and basically this is how the episodes roll. Number one is their beginnings, number two is when they made it and start to kind of fall, and then number three is when they fall, and it goes into why and then what they're doing now, kind of thing. So I'm not going to get too deep into their stories. A lot of people know the stories of those bands and kind of what happened or whatever. But um, as I get into this, it kind of there's another question brought to light that I never really thought about up until I watched this. And it's kind of interesting too to think about this. So, it goes back to, the Sunset Strip days and how hot it was in terms of there were just, so many bands on the strip in the 80s that made it big or relatively big. And, you can go, you've got, Motley Crue and Rat and Dokken and Guns N' Roses and Poison, Cinderella, Britney. I mean, just name a hair metal band, especially an American hair metal band that came out during that time. And they probably played on the Sunset Strip at one time or another, and that's how they got signed. And it talks about all that. It talks about how, all these bands got real big for the most part. And kind of like, that genre of music dominated radio for, almost really 10 years. Um, it dominated the charts. A lot of those bands had number one songs and number one albums throughout the 80s and very early 90s. Um, and then it talks about how all of a sudden it just crashed. Like, very few of those bands made it out unscathed. Um, and there were a few, and quite honestly, the ones that did were the ones that had been around for a little bit anyway. Kiss kind of made it out unscathed. AC/DC made it out unscathed. Of course, neither one of those are really considered hair metal. Kiss kind of got the glam metal look there for a while, and even their sound to an extent. But they had a popularity way before that. AC/DC, same thing. And they never really conformed to any of that stuff during the 80s. They just kept putting out their music. And that's one reason I feel like they made it through. Aerosmith made it through. Van Halen made it through. Um, but some of the newer bands, that the ones that actually came out during this time, almost had to take a hiatus and then regroup in the mid to late 90s and get back together. Um, Def Leppard kind of did that a little bit. Bon Jovi wasn't really too affected by it. But if you look at bands like Rat, Poison, Motley, ultimately, I think, Guns N' Roses, along with Axl being a douche half the time, that was their demise. But you take, the Cinderellas, Brittany Fox, um, Winger. That's a big one in the story. Vixen, right? Skid Row. And, part of Skid Row's problem was some issues with Sebastian Bach as well. But all these bands weren't really able to make it through all of that. Most of them are back together in one form, today. Um, some of them not, like Vixen, she's not Janet's not with them anymore, I don't believe, but they're still going on a little bit. Winger's still playing some stuff. Skid Row's back together with, it's like Dave Sabo and I'm not sure who else, to be honest. But anyway, so it talks about the fall. So, I remember growing up in my high school years on this music. Um, I come from a hard rock, heavy metal background and what I was listening to when I was really young. And then, because this kind of music was in front of you and all over MTV, all over the radio or whatever, it was hard not to be exposed to it, right? And so there were a lot of those bands that, I'm not going to really say I'm ashamed of. I liked Winger when they came out. They had Reb Beach, fantastic guitar player. And he has proven that in the years since that, being in Whitesnake. He was in Dokken for a while and was fantastic. He's a really great guitar player. And they had some really cool riffs and really cool songs. And some of the stuff kind of had an edge, and it wasn't just not bringing on a heartbreak, headed for a heartbreak. It wasn't just all that, right? Um, so I was exposed to that. I liked it. It was popular. I bought the tapes or the CDs or whatever and listened to it and everything. And I graduated from high school in '91 and went off to college. And around, so the summer before that, the summer of '91, you had three hard rock / metal bands that had their albums debut at number one the week they came out. And I don't remember the exact order. No, I'm sorry, there were four. I don't remember the exact order, but they were Skid Row, Van Halen, Metallica, and then Guns N' Roses. All had number one albums between, I think it was a timeline between June and like September of '91. Boom. All right. Now, what you got to remember about that time, before that, the grunge scene had not really exploded yet. Alice in Chains was already out. I think their debut came out in 1990. But Pearl Jam hadn't exploded yet. Nirvana, Soundgarden, um, there's some other ones I can't think of for whatever reason. Stone Temple Pilots, even though they're not really grungy, and I don't think they were from Seattle, they hadn't hit the scene yet. But around late September, October, I forgot who came out first, and all of a sudden you're hearing "Smells Like Teen Spirit," right? You're hearing "Alive." Soundgarden all of a sudden comes out. Alice in Chains is getting bigger. And the next thing you know, towards the end of '91, beginning of '92, and especially once you get into '92 deep, all of a sudden, that's dominating radio. That's dominating MTV. You're still hearing Guns N' Roses because they were in the middle of a huge tour and were maybe the biggest band on the planet at that time. Van Halen was in the middle of a huge tour. Skid Row was in the middle of a decently fair tour because it was their second album. And of course, Metallica was in the middle of it too. And they're another band you can link in there that they made it through all this because they never went away from their sound. They never went, at least up until that point, they never went to, try to be glammy looking or any of that stuff, right? But those bands are dominating the radio along with, and now here comes grunge. Now you're hearing Pearl Jam and Nirvana and Soundgarden and Alice in Chains, and Chili Peppers put out Blood Sugar Sex Magic, which exploded. And so over the course of the next year, the hair metal bands that were around, now, did some of them shoot themselves in the foot? Absolutely. Poison. CC DeVille left the band. Say what you want about CC as a guitar player. I think he's pretty good. He's not great, but he's pretty good. But he was an integral part of that band, right? Motley and Vince part ways. Done, right? Steve Clark had died in Def Leppard. They had put out another album which was gaining some traction and actually pretty big. But after that album and that tour, they kind of started falling. Okay. Guns N' Roses, late '94, early '95, I think, done. Everybody got tired of Axl's bullshit and it was over with. And so some of your bigger bands started to fade. And then some of your bands that had been bigger in the mid to late '80s, very early '90s, started to go nowhere. Rat, Cinderella, Dawkins had pretty much broken up before that anyway. We already mentioned Poison. You know, Winger, Vixen. And I can name it. There's probably a few others I'm forgetting that around 92, 93, into 94, it was over with, man. It was done. And everybody has always thought, and I'm no different, that grunge was what did this to that genre and made its popularity go in the gutter and brought a whole new, you know, kind of kids my age back then were transitioning their listening from that stuff to grunge. And I was no different. I mean, I thought Nevermind's a great album. I think Pearl Jam 10 is one of the best debut albums of all time. Possibly, it's one of the best albums of all time, but definitely one of the greatest debuts of all time. I was never a huge Soundgarden fan. I like a lot of their stuff. Alice in Chains, loved Alice in Chains. And when they put Dirt out, and I think it was late 92, it just exploded them even more. And so in that couple year transition between, late summer, early fall of 91, going into 93, 94, all the glam stuff just went away. It just went away. And so, one reason for that is, and they talk about this in the documentary, one reason for that is that a lot of those bands, especially the ones that came out later as you went on in the 80s, later and later and later into the decade, a lot of them were not putting out substance. They were looking at the image. They were like, because quite honestly, when that was going on in its height, and people were looking for bands, if they had that image, their sound just had to be decent. That's all they cared about was that image because it fit what was selling at the time. But, and so if you think about the bands that kind of made it through that era, and even the ones that kind of didn't make it but were able to pick back up and get bigger again in later years, they had some substance over their image. Motley Crue, regardless of what you think about their music, it was unique. Their look was unique, but there was some substance to their music and to what they were doing. And so, let me turn my phone off so y'all don't have to hear my updates on the Cardinals all this time. But anyway, so it was more genuine. Metallica made it through, GNR made it through, and were able to get better because they were so huge above them. They were almost above and beyond everybody else, right? I think one band I forget about, and they're one of my favorites, is Tesla. They kind of limped through that period a little bit, and they actually made it for a while and then stopped and then got back, and they're still together. And they were another band that they had a little more substance to them. They weren't so glammy looking and everything, but you had like Bango Tango and Enough's Enough, and Nelson was even mentioned in this documentary, and Skid Row was kind of in between on that, but Sebastian had a lot of issues apparently, and they had issues with him, and they just kind of parted ways with him and haven't looked back. But a lot of these bands, it was their image over substance, and that cost them years down the road. And I think the ones that were more concerned with that image as opposed to the substance of their music, the ones that never got back together never really made it, right? They never had at least a decent rise back into some kind of popularity. And so all these things, contributed to it. And everybody says, well, but grunge was the main contributor to it because it was so popular and everybody was just going out and buying their records. And they were that is true. But something was brought up in this documentary about it very early in episode 3 that I had never thought about. It never even crossed my mind. And that is Garth Brooks. Garth Brooks is probably the biggest country performer ever. He is one of the biggest performers in any genre ever. I'm not sure. When I think of the most popular performers they're individuals, not a band, per se, but a solo artist ever, I think of three people. And I'm not going to prioritize them in order, but I think of three people. I think of Elvis, Michael Jackson, and Garth Brooks. Those three, in my mind, are the three most popular solo artists ever. And so Garth Brooks in 1992 was really starting to gain traction. He was exploding. I've seen Garth Brooks a couple of times. The guy puts on a fantastic show. His music, it's kind of poppy, and in a way, it's a new country, and it led to all this new country crap that we have now. That is just, yeah, I can't. I don't like country music anyway. I can appreciate country music. I can especially appreciate older country music, but the newer stuff is just so. New country music is the glam metal of this generation. It's basically what it is. It's taken over that spot. So, and Garth kind of started all that, but he was a pioneer, and so he was able to, nobody had done what he had done and seen, nobody had seen anything like him in a country performance. And like I said, he puts on a great show. I got to give that to him, and I would go see him again, given the opportunity, probably. Um, but here's the thing, and this is what they brought up in the documentary: is this? Everybody thinks that grunge and everything killed hair metal. That it was that if you had to pick an artist or a group of artists that knocked them down out for the count, that's what it may not be. And here's why. In 1992, Nirvana, Pearl Jam, and Red Hot Chili Peppers sold a combined total of 9 million albums in that year. Okay? In comparison, Garth Brooks sold 12.6 million. Think about that. In 1992, the year that grunge really, really started taking over the radio airwaves and hair metal started going this way, Nirvana, Pearl Jam, Chili Peppers combined, 9 million albums sold. Garth Brooks, 12.6. 3.6 more albums he sold than the three of those combined. What does that tell you? It might not have been grunge that killed 80s metal. It could have been a country artist. And that's very interesting. I never thought about that. And I think one reason, because I didn't visualize Garth being that big in 92. I felt like it took him another year or two to get that big, but apparently it did not. So, yeah, maybe he was a bigger contributor to that happening than grunge was. And listen, here's the thing. Uh, Metal has had a huge resurgence since the late 80s. I mean, I'm sorry, since the late 90s with all the when the reunion resurgence happened. To me, the reunion resurgence started with the Eagles and then Kiss. And then you had Journey for a minute, and then, Foreigner and Styx and Kansas and Iron Maiden finally got back together, Judas Priest, and then all these smaller bands started following suit. Rat did it. Motley got back together with Vince Neil. Poison got back together. Def Leppard kind of stayed together but started gaining more traction again. Bon Jovi kept going. AC/DC kept going. And then all this kind of built up. And in the 2000s forward, metal and a lot of hair metal has, had a resurgence. Kev Winger got Winger back together. God bless him. And I don't, if you need to watch this. It's a very interesting documentary. He had a hard time with things. And there's not a lot, there's a little bit boohoo, but I mean, there's a couple things in there that I didn't realize he went through during all this. And for him to be where he is now, he actually is, he's actually writing classical orchestral music now, along with doing Winger. So that guy is a pretty good musician, regardless of what you think about the band Winger. But so yeah, it's one of those things where all these bands they've kind of back together. A lot of them come full circle and done a lot of things. Some of them, don't have a lot of original members or whatever, but they're doing their thing. That's a whole nother conversation. But it kind of came back across. But to think about the impact that grunge had on it, and then realize that Garth Brooks might have had a bigger impact is kind of mind blowing to me. Because, to me, grunge, for the most part, a lot of that was spawned from some heavy metal. It's got a lot of hard, dark grooves and fast guitar. There's some real, and there's still some grunge I love. It kind of went away fast, right? It didn't last quite as long, but it was still to me very valid and good music for the most part. So anyway, that's just kind of on this episode. What I wanted to look at is kind of pose that question. If you ever stop to think that grunge might not have killed metal or had as big a part to play as everybody thinks. 'Cause like I said, I never would have dreamed that Garth Brooks would have had a hand in that. But if you think about it, that would make sense. Um, so yeah, if you get a chance to check this out, it's on Paramount Plus. It's a very interesting documentary. Each episode's about 45 minutes apiece. If you don't have the expensive paid subscription, you gotta watch commercials, but you can watch this whole thing in about 2.5, 3 hours. It's very informative, very cool. There's some funny parts to it, a couple sad parts, not, boo-hoo sad and crying. You're not going to, need a box of Kleenex or anything like that. But um, it's good. It's very entertaining and very well done as well. It's nice. It was nice to watch you kind of reminisce and to learn a few things that I didn't know, especially the Garth Brooks thing, and to get a little more insight into what happened to some of those artists that were very popular back then. So anyway, I just wanted to share that with y'all. If y'all get a chance to check that out on Paramount Plus, I definitely recommend it. And yeah, just in the comments below, let me know what you think about what I've talked about. Let me know what you think about the documentary. I love to have conversations with my viewers on the episodes or anything you want to have a conversation about. So I welcome that always. Like and subscribe. I'm working on some other stuff for some upcoming episodes, so we'll see how that works out. I might have a couple surprises for you. We'll see. Be good to each other. Be good to yourself, and life will be good to you. Peace.